What comes to mind when you think of the Pacific Northwest? Most people think of places like Seattle, Mount Rainier, or the Puget Sound. I think of places like Whatcom County, a place intimately linked with the Puget Sound, from its bustling shellfish industries to its vibrant agriculture, home to the city of Bellingham and Western Washington University. When I think of the Pacific Northwest, I think of the place where I live, the place I call home, a place that's currently under threat.
Today, atmospheric CO2 levels are 40% higher than they were just at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. They're higher than they have been at any time in the last 800,000 years. And this is causing acidification of the ocean. The acid content of the ocean today is about 25% greater than it was just 100 years ago. We've emitted about 500 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Scientists tell us that the most that we can afford to emit is about 1 trillion tons. So we're a bit over halfway there.
Humans, or anthropogenic CO2, we emit about 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere annually, and roughly a third of that is taken up by the oceans, which in turn drops the pH, causing it to acidify. The burning of fossil fuels results in 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide emitted into our atmosphere annually. Approximately 25 to 30% of that emitted carbon is then absorbed by the seawater in our oceans. Once carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans, it reacts with water to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is an unstable molecule, however, and it decomposes into bicarbonate and free hydrogen ion. The free hydrogen ion then comes into contact with carbonate, the building block for the skeletons and shells of calcifiers such as oysters. As a result, the carbonate is then sequestered as bicarbonate, making it unusable to these organisms, causing larval death.
There are other exacerbating factors in the ocean acidification dilemma. Again, CO2 is the big driver, but nutrient pollution from land, that also contributes to ocean acidification because it feeds algae, and algae then decomposes, and that process of decomposition releases more CO2 into seawater.
Atmospheric CO2 levels are about 400 parts per million, or about 40% higher than they were pre-industrial revolution.
Since the industrial era, over the last 250 years, those CO2 emissions, about 25% of them have been absorbed by the ocean. And that's changed the acidity of the ocean by about 33%. And it's affecting us in our hatchery. We can't produce oyster seed because the baby oysters don't have enough calcium carbonate in the water to build their shells.
Although rising atmospheric CO2 levels affect the entire planet, the effects are not felt everywhere in the same way at the same time. And it turns out that Puget Sound, unfortunately, is more sensitive to these rising CO2 levels than many other parts of the ocean. And so the acidification effects here are greater than they are in many other places, and we're already starting to feel them.
Puget Sound is unique because of the upwelling of the acidic waters that normally reside deep in the ocean are being felt here much faster than in the rest of the world. And so really we are at ground zero for some of the effects of ocean acidification.
It's really hard to estimate the economic impact of ocean acidification, both on our industry and on the economy. The shellfish industry here in Washington State contributes about $270 million annually in economic activity, and it employs about 3,200 people directly and indirectly in the industry. None of the shellfish farms on the West Coast in Washington State or anywhere on the West Coast have been able to get adequate oyster seed to meet their orders and fill their demand for several years now. So it's definitely impacting the output from the farm, but we haven't really been able to quantify that.
The Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification was brought together by Governor Gregoire, And it was under the auspices of the Washington Shellfish Initiative. There were 28 people on the panel, a really interesting collection of people with different perspectives. And our job was to try to grapple with a big problem and try to figure out from our different perspectives what some of the solutions were in terms of tackling it.
When Governor Gregoire was challenged on that question, why when Washington only contributes like 0.03% of the CO2 emissions, what can you possibly do to affect the source of this problem? The governor said, well, we can lead. And to her credit, that's exactly what we did. We're leading the way on what we can do on a local basis to address the problem.
One of the things that the panel did talk about, obviously, is the economic impact of something like ocean acidification. I think that the statistic at a state level is that the shellfish industry in Washington generates something like $270 million annually. You've got both the economy and the environment pointing us in the direction of needing to do something about this.
The Blue Ribbon panel came up with 42 recommendations for the governor. Probably the most important ones for our industry were the ones that were focused on adaptation and mitigation. We've learned from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration scientists that we understand from them that ocean acidification is what is killing our oyster larvae, but also we understand from them that because of the CO2 that's already absorbed in the Pacific Ocean that's coming our way, that this problem is going to get worse for the next 30 to 50 years before it starts to get better. And that's presuming that we start to address the CO2 emission problem now.
Overall, the panel's recommendation is that we need to start to act on this now.
Western is making a contribution to solving this problem by the research that we do in the chemistry department as part of the College of Science and Technology, the dedicated faculty that we have here, the amazing students that we have, right? All of these people are making contributions to this problem through the research that they do into things like CO2 fixation, renewable energies, and other things associated with the CO2 problem.
My research is concerned with developing new forms of solar energy, trying to reduce the cost and increase the efficiency of solar energy. It's related to the CO2 problem because most of the carbon dioxide that we emit comes from burning fossil fuels. So to replace those fossil fuels, we need alternative sources of carbon-free energy, of which solar energy is the most promising alternative.
The research that we do at Western involves taking the CO2 molecule and breaking it down into carbon monoxide, which is a useful feedstock. And so that carbon monoxide is much easier to use than CO2 is. And so that can be used for things like making diesel fuels, methanol, so we can make fuels essentially out of CO2.
Chemistry students are involved in every aspect of the research, and they learn how to frame and solve these complicated problems. They understand what the issues are, and they graduate prepared to lead and to innovate, and ultimately to help us find solutions.
Western's role is that Western is part of this community, right? We want to attract bright people not only to work here, but also to go to school here, to be part of the community here, to make meaningful contributions to the community. And so what better way to do that than by tackling problems that are massive, not only on a global scale, but also a local scale.
Western is conducting research into the causes and potential solutions to this problem, scientifically, economically, policy terms. At the same time, we're also training the next generation of scientists, civic leaders, community members, who will, in the end, be the ones who actually solve the problem.
The only way that we're going to solve the ocean acidification problem is to solve the CO2 problem.
When people first learn about ocean acidification, it just seems daunting. I mean, it seems like a horrible problem, and it is. And the solutions all seem bigger than any of us can do individually. And that's not the case. While it's a big problem, there are things that we can do individually that will make a difference. The obvious one is thinking about the people that you're electing in the office Choose people that are progressive and thinking about the impacts of CO2 emissions and willing to embrace change as it relates to that. Just think about your own choices every day as in your purchasing, things that you're purchasing that take fossil fuels to make, or when you drive a car, think about a fuel efficient car, or solar energy for alternative energy for your home. All these things make a difference, and if we all do them individually, collectively, they'll make a difference.
It's a fallacy to believe that all of us can sit back and rely on the politicians to do this work. Because in order for the politicians to do this work, we need to tell them that it's a priority. And there are lots of different ways that we can do that. We need to provide them with the information and the science so that they have an understanding of the issue and therefore can devise policies that will make a difference. So this is not a question of passively watching somebody else take action on this issue. It's a question of all of us finding ways to do that and supporting those politicians that are going to take the ball and run with it.
Everyone has a role to play in this problem. The public has just as large a role as the researchers and the policymakers. When they go to the ballot box, they're not only voting locally, but because this is both a local and a global problem, like these sorts of things have global ramifications.
People should be engaged for two reasons. The first is out of self-interest. Rising CO2 levels affect us all, economically, environmentally. The second reason is, I believe people have an ethical responsibility. We all share this planet. We all share responsibility. Our generation in particular. It's not enough to point fingers. We have to take responsibility.
The Puget Sound is right outside of our back door. And so the problem is right outside our back door. The time to act is now.
My generation is more responsible for this problem than any other. Partly because we've contributed more to emissions, partly because we knew better for the first time. But the solution to the problem lies with the next generation, today's generation of students. Part of Western's role here, in addition to research that helps address the problem, is to prepare and train the next generation of researchers, of community members, of civic leaders, the generation that will ultimately have to solve the problem.
For more information on ocean acidification, Western's research into ocean acidification, as well as what you can do to help, visit the website shown below.